Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from today. Thank you for giving us a bit of time to talk about fighting fraud with identity verification, specifically within the financial and business services sector. My name is Joy Henry. I'm the General Manager for the Financial and Business Services Division here at Sterling. And I'm lucky enough to be joined by Taylor Liggett today, who's our General Manager of our identity sector within Sterling. And today, really, our goal is to spend the next 30 minutes or so talking about insights that we've learned from our financial and business services clients around the world, what they are facing and how fraud has sort of changed over the last few years, and ways or things that they're combating specific to fraud, and how we think we might be able to help in some of those instances. As we move along, if you have any questions, comments, thoughts, we welcome you to enter those questions into the questions section, or we'll also be monitoring the chat. We'll answer questions as we move along through the discussion today. But please, everything is fair game, so ask and we will answer. By way of disclaimer, I should also note that I am not a lawyer and Sterling is not a law firm. So none of the things that we discussed today are necessarily legal advice. This is information that you should take in-house to your counsel and discuss. And if there's any additional questions or follow-ups as a result of those discussions, we're certainly here to continue that conversation with you afterwards. So with that, let's dive in. I'm going to hand off to Taylor.
Thanks, Joy, and hi, everyone. Real pleasure to be with you today. So most of this is going to be a conversation. Highly encourage you all to participate, ask questions, give scenarios that will make this more engaging. But before we get into kind of the meat of the conversation and sharing learnings within FinServ and otherwise, wanted to just level set so that we're all on the same page with kind of what does and does not happen within the background screening process, and just even how identity services work. That I think can hopefully help inform the overall conversation a lot better. So I'd like to start with this, which is just to highlight, Sterling has been really trying to lead the way on identity within the screening and employment space. We've been at it for a while. We really formally launched a new solution coming into this year. And what we have consistently found is that 3 out of 4, or 60–70% of clients, depending on sort of when we survey, just mistakenly believe that identity happens as part of the background check. So that's a critical thing that we need to start overcoming. And to do that, we wanted to just take 2 quick slides to show just kind of how the screening process works. We can advance to the next slide. So, a lot of you probably know this. I won't spend too much time on it, but just as a quick refresher, there are several key steps in the background screening process. But for the purposes of this conversation, the really important one to hone in on is that everything starts with the collection of information from a candidate, right? So whether that collection of information is happening in an applicant tracking system, whether that's happening directly in a Sterling system, otherwise occurring, it's entirely predicated on the information the candidate provides, right? And specifically, a couple key pieces of data. So the full name, the date of birth, the social security number, and the address. Those really drive the next couple steps. So we use, as an example, a locator service, as do most screening companies, to identify other places the person's lived, other names, etc. But if the first set of information is wrong, the locator is going to be incorrect. When we go out and search for information, the searches are only as good as the information that we're searching with. And even if we happen to find information about somebody, but the date of birth doesn't match, or the name doesn't match, we're not going to report it because there's liability that's associated with that, of course, and the chance of getting it wrong. So, really, really critical that upfront data comes in correctly, not even to mention sort of identity fraud that can happen, but just from a workflow perspective. So if you want to move to the next slide, you can see pretty simple. We are huge advocates of just starting the process with verified identity. I think it's important to call out that the US is uniquely behind. Many other developed countries, Canada, UK, Australia, just name a few, they actually require that identity verification happens prior to screening and prior to running a criminal history check. The US, we're sort of playing a bit of catch up. I think it's a no-brainer that if we were designing background screening today, it would be designed and starting with identity verification, but we're working to really help educate clients and insert that in the process. So basically the way that this functions is you start the entire process, candidate goes through identity verification, that information is then verified, including all their biographic data, and used to inform all the other steps. If you want to go to the next slide for me, this presentation is very purposefully designed to not be a sales presentation about our particular identity solution. We feel very strongly about it. We think it's truly a best-in-class solution. We'd love to talk to you more about it, but just to give some examples so that you all understand kind of how this can function. What occurs is essentially we have identity verification baked into our Candidate Hub data collection process. So just basically a first step. Make sure the person is who they say they are, make sure their data is accurate, and there are a whole bunch of options you can use. So I think the key takeaway here is as you're considering this, think about it like background screening. It's not necessarily that one size fits all, right? You don't necessarily have to apply the same standard to everybody. You can see some of the options using telecom and device verification. You can do government issued documents. You can do facial matching. You can do in person. A lot of you do fingerprinting otherwise. We have failover options like live video chat. There's a whole bunch of things you can do, and you can even stack these up all the way to meet like government standards, like identity assurance level 2 as an example. But ultimately, you can kind of determine the right steps there. Typically, it takes between 2 and 3 minutes for a candidate to go through this at the start of the process. But just to give an idea of how this works, the only other thing I'll say before we move into the broader conversation is that we're also in the midst of a really big sea change that's happening. It's just part of the continued digital revolution, and that is to say that there's a lot of focus on digital identity right now and how we sort of prove ourselves in the increasingly digital world, remote work, and on and on and on. And so solutions like what Sterling has in our case with ID.me also work with pre-verification. In other words, you only have to go through this once, kind of claim your digital identity, and then that moves with you. So we also now have a nice percentage of people that come in that actually don't have to go through identity verification new, but just use their existing login to move forward in the process. So hopefully that helps kind of set a baseline. What we really wanted to do is that we launched general availability of our US ID.me based solution, fully integrated earlier this year. We've now had, a couple months of learnings, right? We've worked with a number of clients. We've worked with a number of financial and business services companies, and we have some learnings that we really wanted to discuss today, bring out and talk through. So maybe if we can just move into that. And Joy, maybe we can just start. And did you want to share some of the examples from your side, some things that you and your team have seen and heard from clients to kick us off?
Yeah, it's been interesting. I was thinking about this the other day, the types of conversations we had with clients 5 years ago, say, compared to the conversations that we're having now. And 5 years ago, the challenges that we had were about validating time on a resume. Did they work at a certain place for as long? Did they have the position that they said they had? Do they really have a certification to perform a certain function within the financial services world, as an example? And so we spent a lot of time on validating those points, but we really didn't talk very much about, is the person actually who they say they are? And that conversation is the one that we're having now. So I think with the growth or the prevalence of remote work in this particular industry, which is not something that we would have been talking about prior to the pandemic, and seeing a lot more movements from firm to firm, people moving company to company, as well as a lot of firms moving into retail space and changing the types of candidates or expanding the types of candidates that they may be hiring into their organizations. Things that we're hearing are just the sheer number of fraud cases that are being uncovered has increased exponentially for firms, which then leads them to, how can you help us to manage this? Like, why is this happening? How do we avoid it? We think remote work is definitely driving it, but we're seeing really interesting things like someone gets hired for a job and then it's sold to someone offshore, and someone completely different is actually doing that remote-based position. Or we've even had recently a scenario where a different person physically showed up to the firm after going through the screening process and clearing the screening process. So Joy applied and cleared backgrounds, and Taylor showed up for work. So the examples that a lot of these companies are trying to kind of work through are so different from what they've had to work through a few years ago.
Yeah, and it's a couple great examples. I'll share a few more things from my side that I've seen as well. So you named it. Well, actually, before I do that, let me also give kind of one other reason. Like you mentioned remote work, I absolutely think that's a factor. But another thing that sort of unique that's happened in the last couple of years is, of course, the pandemic, COVID. And what occurred during 2020 was like exponential increases in identity fraud. And one of the reasons for that is because the prize for it became a lot bigger. There was access to unemployment benefits and PPP loans, and like there were some very lucrative things that brought in organized crime and a big investment in people's personal information and in systems that can commit identity fraud at scale. And so once these organizations made that investment and the payoff was so big, they're looking for continued new ways of kind of monetizing that and continuing it. And so I think that's another factor that's caused this rise. And then frankly, I think there has been some awareness with bad actors out there that there's this vulnerability in the new hire screening process where identity verification doesn't happen. And so they're coming up with these creative ways of sort of exploiting that to make their way in. And I think, we've seen this now happening in terms of why. Of course, you never fully know why, but like the stuff that we've pieced together is that it runs the gamut of someone who may not be qualified to get the job. Like even apart from screening, we've heard a number of stories about one person going through an interview and another person showing up for work. You see examples of people who have criminal histories that are trying to just simply evade that. So we've had a bunch of stuff. I know you've seen as well with people purposely mistyping social security numbers or purposely mistyping dates of birth or throwing off their names or whatever to try and evade the screen. And then we've seen this kind of wholesale identity fraud where we're early on, but it seems there's at least a scenario where people are trying to infiltrate financial services orgs in particular to gain access to systems to either further perpetuate these type of issues or commit whatever other sort of malintent they have. So I think part of, as we discuss, it's important to kind of raise an early alarm and say, hey, we're seeing this certainly more than I expected to see this. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I think I said too during one of our conversations recently, like I felt a little naive actually when I thought about it. I just assumed that, with the amount of rigor that's put into the application process and the comprehensive screening that financial services organizations do, it just wouldn't be a place that they would find a lot of success or put a lot of energy into. So it has been interesting. And one of the weak points that we've discovered, and you actually just reminded me of this, so I'm glad you said it. One of the weak points that we've discovered this for firms in particular is in third party or contractors that gain access to the building. So IT maintenance, even, someone who's hired to come in and deliver office supplies. Those people potentially have access to parts of the organization where valuable or protected data or information is. And so we're seeing it through those angles too. So it's not even just who they're having apply to the firm directly, but those third parties that come through the door as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, really good point. And as we talk about recommendations for this group, I think doing kind of a wholesale evaluation of your entire hiring processes and certainly your use of any contractors, subcontractors, et cetera, that may be performing any of these services, because assuming they have any access to systems or buildings or whatever, the vulnerability certainly exists there. I think when we started out on this and we were really working to bring this to market, I'm pretty close to this, of course, and like my personal view was that we were going to see a lot of stuff with biographic data being incorrect, either because it was purposefully done or it was accident. Like, of course, we see a lot of accidents, right? Just transposing digits, going by nicknames, not putting middle name, whatever. So I knew we'd see a lot of that. And I knew we'd see some identity fraud, but I have been shocked at the extent of identity fraud that we've seen and the creative ways people are going about it. So, there's a significant amount of collusion even that's happening where people will collude. And you brought up the point of like selling a job. I think certainly that could be happening. But we're also seeing whether it's just friends working together or someone paying someone to complete a certain step for them. That simplifies this. It's been really surprising, I think, to see the extent at which people are going. And I can only assume that like this is happening, across sectors. We shouldn't, just to be clear, like this is not just a financial services problem, but I think it has been seen most acutely within that space. And the only sort of guess I have is, financial services is such a fortress. There's so much that has gone into protecting these businesses, and so a weak spot that's identified by bad actors is going to be exploited pretty quickly.
Yeah, and it's really started the conversation with the companies that we work with around, does it make sense to validate identity one time or a couple times throughout the process? And we are starting to hear more and more companies talk about an interest in exploring, do you validate identity at time of application, so on the front end? And then does it make sense to do it again at point of offer? So probably when the background screen is launched. And then does it make sense to do it again at their first day of work? So when they either log in from that PC at home or physically walk into the building, they go through a three-step touch with regards to identity verification.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because one of the kind of exciting parts of this is that we've been able to work with our customers and start to kind of innovate in these areas. So, we came to market with a really good solution of kind of it being embedded, but the focus was at the point of background screen. And that's obviously helped with quite a few issues. But certainly what we're seeing is there are at least a number of cases where having kind of a multi-step workflow could be valuable. So that's something that we're really working on. And then, we've had discussions with customers about even tying this into like a fingerprint, that in-person piece, or like a kiosk that could be a check-in when you come into work, or like an app if you're remote based, even potentially having like the actual selfie someone takes, if they do that, passed as another checkpoint. So, this is something we're going to have to continue to stay on top of and work with customers and kind of keep innovating on. So I'm glad you brought that up as an example. That's something else everyone should look at, because it may make sense in different parts to do identity verification at different points in time.
And I think the other topic that we talk about a lot as we explore whether or not this is a fit for the company itself is that there's this real keen focus to make sure that candidate experience is smooth and frictionless as possible, particularly in financial services where there's the application process alone is laborious and heavy because it has to be because of the nature of the jobs. But I think the other thing that's really important is when we explore these things that we've really tried to create something that is smooth, it's quick, it feels very, I'll say consumer-like. I've gone through it. It's about 90 seconds from start to finish, including them validating my cell phone number to the person that I say I am. So I think that's also really important, because I think initially a lot of people were concerned about adding another step into the process.
It's such a good point, and it's actually like really exhibit A of why we went so in deep with ID.me, because they are sort of uniquely in this spot where you can, like, the improvement to I would go as far as to say in a lot of cases, it's not even adding friction, it's actually improving the candidate experience.
Right.
And the reason for that is because, so for those of you who don't know, ID.me is the largest digital identity network in the US by like a mile. They have 90 million people, a little over 90 million people. That equates to about 35% of the US adult population. So What that means is those people have gone through this through another application, the IRS, Social Security Administration, the state, like they're used very broadly throughout the government, many organizations. And so then if they come into this, it's literally as simple as them logging in to their ID.me and then consenting to share this information with Sterling for the background check. All that information is then auto imported into the system. So they don't have to do any data entry, like they can just cruise through the process. So we've had excellent candidate feedback in these cases who come into this and are like, oh, great, one less step I have to do. I just log in, share my info. Mm-hmm. And what's also been interesting is that we have seen really solid pre-verified stats from your customers within financial services. So for whatever reason, there seems to be some solid overlap with the ID.me user base in financial services. So as an example, one of the customers that we have this in live with consistently is in like a 50 to 60% pre-verified rate, as compared to many of our clients are in like a 30 to 40%. So that, like half of their candidates are coming through with a super streamlined process. And then even the other ones that go through it, that's the only time they have to do it. And then anytime they do it in their personal life or future career, they already have that taken care of. So that's a really good point.
Yeah, I actually just leveraged it on something else that I was buying recently. It asked me to validate, so it was kind of nice. I didn't have to do it again.
Sure. So I know we're just conscious of time. I don't know if we have any questions or not. I know we have 7 minutes left. Don't know if we've seen any come through.
There was one question around people thinking that the SSN trace, that's pretty typical in every background screen, how that works with ID.me.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think one of the problems that's happened in this industry being background screening, is that some tools, most notably SSN Trace, have gotten conflated with identity. I think in some cases it's been up to interpretation, and in some cases companies have actively kind of perpetuated this issue. But the important thing to know is that SSN Trace is just a locator tool. Meaning it's only as good as the information it's provided, and then it's just going to go grab a bunch of other information based on that information to inform the search. So it's not taking into account, is that information different or not? And even for some of the providers that have tried to do that have tried to like flag, oh, this SSN didn't match or whatever, we've seen recently class action lawsuits around this, because you can't, like, that's not an accurate form of verifying identity. Most of the trace providers actually have big disclaimers. It can't be used for identity. So I think point one is just understanding that separation and just understanding what it does and doesn't do. It's obviously a critical tool. There's a reason it's kind of ubiquitous within screening. It's an important step. Where we're working to go is to consolidate a lot of that, to have sort of a singular initial step that is identity plus trace. Right now, technically, they're separate steps. We're working to kind of bring that in for just an even cleaner experience, and also just a little more digestible for clients, and maybe something that can become an industry standard. And then, the other thing, I'm guessing this is going to be asked as a question, so I'll just get in front of it, is with I-9. So a lot of people ask, oh, okay, great, well, I'm doing identity verification. How does this relate to I-9? So the reality right now is that USIS, they have this in-person requirement. It was written, I'm not kidding, in 1985, and it has not changed since that point in time. So there's some tweaks we should evaluate on that. We actually worked with them on a proposal late last year about effectively how to modernize this. I'm very confident we'll get to that point where this can serve as that step. There's no reason it can't. I mean, it seems a little nuts that the IRS and Social Security Administration, everyone trusts this, but it can't work for that. So I'm confident we'll get there, and then it will become an even more seamless workflow. In the meantime, there's some creative ways we can leverage this tool to help kind of simplify the I-9 process. So for any clients interested in that, we'd be happy to talk with you about ways you can still leverage this for remote workers. But in the future, we hope to have that government regulation modified so that it's even easier.
Yeah. And then, the other thing that just came to mind too, Taylor, is when we have a tool like this upfront earlier in the process, it actually can promote some sense of cost savings. So if someone can't get through the identity verification process, it won't actually allow them to get through the rest of the screening process, and therefore companies are not they're not spending money on screens for clients or for candidates that won't pass that initial pass. And I think that's just one piece that, you know, it's not necessarily just about like catching them, it's also about preventing them from even continuing in the process, right?
Yeah, that's a really good call, because a bunch of ways you can use this for cost savings. So one is like the obvious, you're exactly right. Like if it's going to be a bad actor, stop them right away. Don't pay for the screen on top of it. But then secondarily, like there's a bunch of stuff where it's like, oh, we ran this background check and now we know the date of birth's wrong or the name's wrong. So now we got to rerun it twice. Middle ground instances where you have someone come through and they hit that SSN trace and it's unperformable. You know, is that because we have the wrong one? Is that because they're not old enough? They don't have credit history, right? You're asking all those things. You can confidently say, nope, that's the person. Proceed with the check. The other thing on a cost basis, we don't talk about this very often, but I think it's a good differentiator for what we do. We actually don't charge the clients at all for anyone who doesn't get through identity verification. So if they come to this step and they, you know, try 5 times and, you know, they don't get through or whatever, we only charge once for the candidates that come through successfully. So it is really a good way of kind of early on, someone at our company described it as kind of like a bouncer at the door that just makes sure the right people get through,
Right.
and you're not having to sort of deal with, whether from a cost or risk perspective, anyone who shouldn't be getting through that door.
Yeah. So I know we only have about 3 minutes left, and Taylor, I know you've been out doing a lot of speaking engagements and really talking to a lot of people about this. Do you think there's anything else that would be insightful or important for people to take away today?
Yeah, so the thing that I would say is good for this group to just somewhere in the back of your head kind of consider is that once you have, just beyond identity verification, just kind of glimpse into the future a little bit, like once you have a foundational trusted digital identity network, where we're really moving to is to enable even the portable credentials that can be tied to someone. So if you can envision, you know, we already have this reality now of kind of pre-verified identities coming, but imagine the other types of things you can add. Why do you have to constantly re-verify education, employment history, things that don't change, right? So we sort of refer to that as digital wallet capability, and that's another really exciting thing to kind of watch this space and see where that goes.
Excellent. Okay. So this won't be the last that you hear from us on the identity front, but we did think it was important as a follow-up to the webinar that Taylor did with our compliance team last month to make sure that that this particular sector had some real life examples and things that we're already seeing from existing clients that we're working with today. So if anyone has any questions or any follow-up that you didn't want to ask here, but you'd like to ask later, you'll get a follow-up email from us. So please feel free to reach out. There's also an abundance of information on this on our website. So if you go to sterlingcheck.com and hit the identity section, you'll be able to find some additional information there as well. Again, want to thank you for giving us 30 minutes of what is probably a very busy day. So we thank you for your time and have an excellent rest of your week.
Thanks, everyone.